In the first 11 lines of the Aeneid, Virgil does the two things that an epic poet is supposed to do. He announces his subject and he invokes the muses. But where Homer does these two things together, Virgil kind of separates them out. At the top of the screen you see the first two lines of the Iliad. Min Aeneid Thea. Sing the anger, goddess, the anger of Achilles the son of Peleus, the destructive anger that brought 10,000 sufferings upon the Achaeans. Right below that you see the first two lines of the Odyssey. Andra moyene pemusa. Tell me about the man, muse, the man of many wiles who wandered very far after he sacked the sacred citadel of Troy. In both poems, a single word is enough to define the theme. Anger, man, and the imperative mood of the verb is used to involve the muse right away. Sing, talk about. These words are very carefully chosen. You may think that the Iliad's about the entire Trojan War, from the rape of Helen to the fall of the city, but most of that stuff isn't in there. It's really just about the anger of Achilles. His anger with Agamemnon that makes him walk away from the fight, and his anger with Hector that makes him come back in and go a little beyond what human beings should do in war. The Odyssey, too, seems to be about a lot of stuff, but it's always focused on this man, whether from the perspective of his son who's out there looking for him, or his wife who's home waiting for him, or the crazy stories that he tells about his own journey. It's all about Odysseus. Now, Virgil uses two words to define his theme, arma virumque, because first he'll describe the wanderings of Aeneas, and then the war that the Trojans have to fight before Rome can be founded in Italy. And he doesn't call upon the muse to sing the song or tell the story, although he'll later ask the muse to explain the causes of Juno's anger. He begins his poem in the first person singular, I sing, right? Arma virumque cano. Virgil will expand on both aspects of his theme before he gets around to invoking the muse directly. He'll start with a relative clause, a qui clause, defining Aeneas as the man who first came, qui primus venit. He came ab oris, from the shores Troiae, of Troy, to Italy. Notice the absence of the preposition ad in front of the word Italiam. Virgil often uses basic case functions here, accusative of motion toward, where we would expect the guidance of prepositions in more prosaic Latin. The nominative profugus defines Aeneas as an exile, and the ablative fato explains that he has been exiled by fate. Now the que we find on the end of the word lavinia adds an object to the verb venit. Aeneas didn't just come to Italy, Italiam, but he also came to the Lavinian shores. Litus litoris is a neuter noun. Lavinia litora is neuter plural accusative. Let's go back through this sentence with the elements more or less in order. Then think about the way we need to move words around to make this start to sound like English. Arms and the man I sing, of Troy who first from the shores, to Italy by fate an exile, and to the Lavinian shores he came. English usually likes to have the direct object follow the verb. So for us, I sing of arms and the man sounds a little more natural than arms and the man I sing. This solves two problems at the same time, because another thing we need to do in English is make the relative pronoun qui come immediately after its antecedent. I sing of arms and the man who. To avoid confusion, we'll also want to keep the verb that agrees with this pronoun and any modifiers as close to it as possible. So I sing of arms and the man who first came. Then we'll add the details specifying where he came from the shores of Troy, where he went to Italy and the Lavinian shores, and why he made the journey, because he was exiled by fate. Now, I've already pointed out the absence of a preposition in front of the word Italiam. The accusative case all by itself can suggest the idea of motion toward without using the word ad, meaning to. This is something that Virgil does all the time, and not only with the accusative case. Another thing Virgil does all the time involves a figure we call prolepsis. Prolepsis is when an adjective, or a noun in the genitive case, precedes the noun that it modifies and is separated from that noun by one or more words. There are two examples in this sentence. The first one involves the genitive Troiae, which depends upon the last word in the line, oris, from the shores of Troy. But until we get to the end of the line, we don't know how to interpret this word. Is it a man of Troy? Do I sing of Troy? This creates a kind of tension which is resolved when we get to the end of the line. From the shores of Troy. This is what prolepsis does, and Virgil does it a lot. The second example occurs in the very next line with the adjective Lavinia. As we've seen, this modifies the noun litura to the Lavinian shores. But until we see the word shores at the beginning of the following line, we don't know what to do with Lavinia. And the Lavinia he came. Right? So again, a little bit of tension that's resolved at the beginning of the next line. This occurs so often in Latin poetry, and so seldomly in prose, that over time you'll come to think of it, along with the meter, as one of the things that makes poetry sound poetic. At this point, Virgil feels the need to reintroduce Aeneas, to remind us who he's talking about using a demonstrative pronoun, ile, that man. And then he immediately describes him as iactatus, having been cast about. Everything else in this line and the next one adds to this idea of iactatus. So first of all, he mentions that he's been cast about a lot. Multum is used adverbially. Then he uses the correlatives et to explain where this happened. He was cast about et terris et alto, both on the lands and at sea. Altum means deep, and it's often used as a substitute for the deep sea in poetry. The next line describes how and why this happened to Aeneas. He was cast about vi superum, by the power of the gods. Now, vi is the ablative of vis, which means power or force, and the gods are described as superum, genitive plural here, because they're up above, so the superi. The same way the alto described the deep sea, the superi can describe the gods. So we're being poetic here. We're not using the regular words for things. So he was cast about on the lands and at sea by the power of the gods. And then why this happened to him. Saeve memorem eunonis ob iram. And here, word order is a little problematic because the why is the last thing that you find out, right? He was cast about ob iram. Ob means because of, on account of. Iram is the accusative object of this preposition, because of the anger. Now, there's an interlocking word order here. The anger is accusative, and it's described as memorem, the mindful anger, the anger that remembers. This is modified by a genitive because the person or the being that's angry is Juno. So it's the anger of Juno. And Juno is described as Saevae. Saevae memorem eunonis ob iram, because of the mindful anger of savage Juno. This is what's known as a transferred epithet, which is just a fancy way to say flipped adjectives. Because, of course, it's the anger that's savage. It should be the Saevam iram. And it's Juno that doesn't forget. So it's the savage anger of Juno that never forgets. But there's a flipping of the adjectives. The agreement of the adjectives goes in the other direction. The anger is mindful and Juno is savage. I mean, I suppose Juno could be savage, but can anger have a memory? I'm not sure. This is a common poetic device. We say it's poetic because it happens a lot in poetry. Transferred epithet is the technical term, which I just want you to know for AP Latin purposes. Okay, the next clause that begins line 5 is parallel to what we saw in line 3. In line 3, Aeneas is multum jactatus, cast about a great deal. In line 5, he is multa passus, having suffered many things. In line 3, he was cast about et terris et alto, both on the land and at sea. In line 5, he has suffered many things et bello. So the quoque is the thing that connects them together, and he also suffered many things in the war. At the end of line 5, Virgil finally gets around to the goal of all of this wandering and suffering. So Aeneas has been multum jactatus, much cast about. He is multa passus, he has suffered many things, dum conderet urbem, until he could found a city. The word dum with the subjunctive means until. If the verb had been indicative, condebat, then he would have been cast about and suffered while he was founding a city. But of course, first he wandered, first he suffered, so that he could one day found a city. Okay, at the beginning of line 6, que adds another subjunctive verb to this dum clause, inferretque. So dum conderet urbem in line 5, inferretque Deus latio, until he could found a city and bring his gods to Latium. Again, the subjunctive means that he hasn't brought his gods to Latium yet, but he went through all this stuff so that one day he would be able to. And the use of the dative case, latio here, is kind of like the use of Italiam up here. We might have expected a prepositional phrase in prose, to Latium, but instead in poetry, Virgil uses the dative of motion towards. He makes a case function serve the purpose that we expect to be accomplished with a prepositional phrase. Virgil ends this long sentence with a list of things that arose from Aeneas accomplishing his purpose. There's no verb in these 3 clauses. The word unde means whence. So he says, until he could found a city and bring his gods into Latium, whence the genus Latinum, whence the Latin race, and the Alban fathers, and the walls of lofty Rome. Now, in the last 3 words, we see another example of this thing called the transferred epithet, right? Logically speaking, prosaically speaking, it's the walls that are lofty, not Rome itself. But by flipping the adjectives in this way, you give it a little more of a poetic resonance, right? The walls of lofty Rome. I'm going to stop there for now and come back next time to talk about Virgil's invocation of the Muse. So that's all for now. See you next time.